Are these all really COVID-19 deaths? Is it possible somehow the calculations are incorrect? Luckily, we're not alone. There have been reports all over the world of people questioning. We remember Italy all the way back when this pandemic started saying, really it appears that only about 9 to 12% of the amount of people we reported as dying from COVID-19 actually died of other causes. But this is now really becoming front and center and getting some headlines because of the former senator and doctor, Scott Jensen, who has been on our show before. These are the headlines that he's been making in some work that he's doing. Minnesota state lawmakers call for audit of COVID-19 death certificates. Minnesota lawmakers say coronavirus deaths could be inflated by 40% after reviewing death certificates. Minnesota senator, physician blows whistle, the bizarre non-COVID types of deaths being blamed on COVID. To get to the bottom of this, I am joined by really one of my heroes, Dr. Scott Jensen. Dr. Jensen, so what's this all about? Take me through it. Why did I know you were talking about how the death certificate and filling it out as a doctor had changed months ago. Where do we find ourselves now, and what are you trying to do about it?
Well, thank you, Dale, for having me on. It actually started back in April. And what happened was the Minnesota Department of Health emailed physicians in Minnesota a communication which linked to a CDC document as well. And what really changed was on a death certificate, there's two parts. Part one, which is really the most important, and part two, where you can put contributing conditions. An example might be the most helpful. If I have a heart attack today and tomorrow I end up having an angiogram and a stent is placed, but too much muscle was killed in my heart attack, so that 2 months from now I develop congestive heart failure and I'm going, if you will, the wrong way, and a month later I develop severe pneumonia and I die. The death certificate in part one, the top line completed should be the immediate cause of death, and it would be pneumonia. And that would be due to or as a consequence of congestive heart failure, which was due to or a consequence of the heart attack, which was due to or a consequence of coronary artery disease. But it's that bottom line that's completed that's called the underlying cause of death. That's what we tabulate. That's what goes into the Federal Registrar of Disease. When we say that 3 million Americans die every year and 650,000 of them die of heart disease, it becomes, if you will, a conclusion that says 650,000 death certificates should have on the underlying cause of death line a cardiovascular diagnosis. Well, we found that in Minnesota, that if you look at the COVID-19 deaths, and at that time, the first time we looked, there were some 3,000. We said, okay, let's look, real simple. Just look at the underlying cause of death line, which is the bottom line that's completed. It could be line A, B, C, or D. It's just got to be the bottom line. How many of those had COVID-19 or a COVID-19 related diagnosis on it? And right off the bat, we found that there were some 700 or 800 that did not have a COVID-19 diagnosis on it. If you look here on this graph in front of us,
Yeah.
if you look at the line that says negative 603 in the right margin, those were deaths that were not placed on the, these are COVID deaths from the Department of Health, but COVID was not on the underlying cause of death line. It might have been somewhere else, line one, line two, but it wasn't on the line. On the underlying cause of death line might have been congestive heart failure, drowning, motor vehicle accident, shotgun. In those situations, you can only die of one thing. You can't be listed twice in the Federal Registrar. So if I die of a heart attack, it's going to be a cardiovascular death. If I happen to, in my last 2 weeks of life, be detected with a COVID-19 test, that doesn't mean I died of it. Yes, you could say I died with it, but Deborah Birx said that can't happen. So what you would do with that, if you wanted to as a physician, you could put that in part two under contributing condition. But again, back to last April, the Department of Health said, oh, by the way, if a contributing condition is COVID-19, don't put it as a contributing condition. Put it in part one as a cause of death. But if it's something else like asthma or emphysema, for heaven's sakes, put it in part two. Relegate it to part two. So clearly, the dedication that we've demonstrated for the last several decades to precision and a sequence of causation was being thrown out the window. And the question was, why?
It's really, really something that has been staggering. Do you have an answer? I mean, are you moving towards a hypothesis or a theory on why?
Well, I think we have two things we have to look at, and they're not going to necessarily be any fun to talk about. But the first one is, if you want to paralyze people's own ability to think for themselves and to stand up for themselves, frighten them, scare them so bad that they can't think straight. They're paralyzed. That's one way to control large groups of people. And I think we're seeing it. But the other thing that happens is you have to follow the money. At the time I first spoke up in April, I did not know that the amount of CARES Act dollars that would be distributed to hospitals and clinics would ultimately depend upon how many COVID-19 admissions a hospital might have. So what I've learned over the last few months is that if between January 1st and June 10th, a hospital was able to reach the threshold of 161 COVID-19 admissions, they would receive $77,000 per admission on top of what they'd already been paid. This was dollars from the CARES Act. This was in the second phase, the high impact distribution. Well, if you actually look at who benefited the most there, you would look at the eastern states who had their surge first. You would look at New York State, New Jersey. They had their surge in March and April and May. There were dollars helping to cover that. We saw healthcare organizations making huge dollars in the second and third quarter. Fourth quarter report for United Healthcare, I think they made some $2 billion.
Whoa.
Bottom line is, you do have to follow the dollars. And when you follow the dollars, you'll see that if you had your surge in the first half of 2020, you would get compensated for it. But if you look at a state like Minnesota, where we had our surge, and you would not necessarily get any additional dollars.
Wow. So what do you hope to do with this information as you have this audit? What is the goal?
We need to call for an audit. Every state needs to say, we're going to do this right. We want to compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges.
Right.
That's what we need to do.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, Scott, I was giving a talk just a week ago, and I was laying out a timeline. And sometimes I'm putting together my PowerPoint at the last minute. I was going to do this after you were off, but I want to show you something that has got me staring at my ceiling as I try to go to sleep at night. I want to show you a timeline. I'm not sure if you've looked at this, but do you realize that in February of this year, actually February 17th, we had been watching what was happening in China, and then the top disease official, of course they're talking about Anthony Fauci himself, says the risk of coronavirus in the USA is minuscule. Skip masks and just wash your hands. Saying don't bother wasting your time with masks and things like that. We don't have a real issue. I've looked at the science. I work with the Wuhan labs. I know what we're talking about. February 17th, he says this really is a non-issue. If we're healthy, we should do just fine. Then something shocking happens. I can't explain it, but from February 17th, suddenly on the 28th, so 11 days later, someone who is not a doctor, but is one of the #1 funding bodies, the WHO, makes this statement. Bill Gates, coronavirus may be once in a century pathogen we've been worried about. This is 11 days after Tony Fauci said this is a non-issue. Bill Gates makes the exact opposite statement, saying, I have been preparing for this. We've been running Event 201. We've been doing clinics on this. And I am telling you, this is what we're preparing for. He's not a doctor. He funds WHO, Gavi. You know, we can talk about investments into vaccines and all of those things. I mean, that itself is a shocking timeline. And man, I wish I was a fly on the wall in the phone calls that went, why did we go from Fauci saying non-event to within 11 days, no, this is the great pandemic of our lifetime. But take a look at this. That's February 28th, right? Bill Gates made this crazy statement. I believe he even put more funding in the WHO right around those days. But within 4 days, on March 4th, our own government CDC agency puts out a brand new guideline on how we are going to count COVID-19 deaths for this now announced pandemic by a man who's not a doctor but seems to have a lot of controls over public health around the world. And here's what this document told doctors to do. It is important to emphasize that coronavirus disease 2019 or COVID-19 should be reported on death certificate for all dissidents where the disease caused or is assumed to have caused or even just contributed to death, just as you described there, Dr. Jensen. If the dissident had other chronic conditions such as COPD or asthma that may have also contributed, these conditions can be reported in Part 2, the problem you are pointing out. But this is, I think, the most shocking. What happens if the terms reported on the death certificate indicate uncertainty? If the death certificate reports terms such as probable COVID-19 or likely COVID-19, these terms would be assigned the new ICD-9 code, which I assume is caused by COVID-19. It is not likely that NCHS will follow up on these cases, basically telling doctors, if you want to bring in some extra income and you want to make this assumption and you don't do a test to prove it, don't worry, we're going to look the other way on this. This happens 4 days after Bill Gates announces that this is going to be a massive pandemic. Suddenly, we change the way we have always counted deaths, which you have got to assume is going to skyrocket the rate immediately. When I was putting that together last week, my jaw dropped. Have you looked at that timeline before? And do you not find that sort of synergy of the public world announcements and how conveniently we made a shift that would show or create a pandemic, if you will, just by simply changing the way we calculate the numbers?
You're absolutely right, Dale. And actually, another thing happened too. The World Health Organization came out and said that the code for COVID-19 that was laboratory confirmed would be U07.1. But if you were going to make an assumption or a probable, it would be U07.2. At the same time, the World Health Organization came out and said that, United States and CDC said, well, we're not going to use U07.2. The message being, if you use that, if you say probable, which would normally be U07.2, it'll automatically default to U07.1, which means that if you say probable, it's just as good as confirmed. And when you do that, we're then told, oh, and by the way, don't worry, you won't be audited. On top of that, a month after February passed, we had Dr. Fauci in the New England Journal of Medicine once again saying that COVID-19 was behaving like a bad flu epidemic. So even in that time, there continued to be this conflicting data, and Dr. Fauci was in the middle of it, saying, oh, and that article in the New England Journal of Medicine had a co-author, a guy named Robert Redfield, who was head of CDC. So it is absolutely astonishing how many stumbles, bumbles, and hiccups we've seen out of the World Health Organization, the CDC, and anybody else who wanted to join the conversation if they had enough money.
Well, I think, Dr. Jensen, what you're doing is critical. I've never seen, in all of my investigations with the doctors for 6 years, the work I've done on the high wire, I have never seen modern medicine take a step back in the quality of its data collection, to actually take away information and have less information hiding underlying causes as a part of the discussion. This is an incredible moment in history. I hope that you are leading the way, that we truly do have an audit. Because, look, there will be viruses in the future. We've lowered the bar pretty low, 0.26% death rate warrants shutting down this nation. But we need to know how we're counting it, and we cannot compare this year's apples to last year's oranges. We do not have any way of knowing what coronavirus deaths would have been last year, or flu deaths, you know, when I'm talking about 2019 in terms of heart disease and cancer. They have turned this thing entirely on its head. It is so good to know that someone out there cares and is doing these audits. We will do everything we can to support you and hopefully make this a nationwide campaign. Thank you for your efforts and thank you for your continued diligence. And you have been under a lot of fire for the work that you do. You truly are a hero, Dr. Jensen, and it's a privilege to know you.
Thank you, sir.
Take care, and we'll talk to you soon.